Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of EDU 280. This week's theme is Language 101. I'm calling it Language 101 because I'm basically smashing an entire 100 level linguistics course into 12 slides. Wish me luck. Okay, I've incorporated an image here that I found online. It's this beautifully drawn tree of languages, and I've just included it to show you how wildly complicated language is. So this lecture's out of necessity. It's going to be kind of superficial. We're just barely scratching the surface of language here. But I have to try. I have to try to give you an overview because we really cannot talk about literacy if we don't all have a similar foundation of language theory. Yeah, I said it better on the bullet point. Without language, there is no literacy. Okay, here we go. What is language? You do have some textbook reading assignments this week, and so I did want to just drop in the official textbook definition right into this PowerPoint. And I don't generally read PowerPoints to my listeners, but this one's worth it. Okay, language is a system of intentional communication and self-expression through sounds, signs, or gestures, or symbols that are understandable to others. Language also refers to a symbol-based, rule-governed, multidimensional system that is used to represent the world internally and to others through the process of communication. Well, that's a mouthful. It can really be boiled down to communication, but not to the extent that language and communication are the same exact thing. And then I have included my personal working definition of language. I come from a reading science, linguistics background, and composition background, and I think that's reflected in my slightly different definition. Language is a complex, rule-bound, organized system of communication using signs and/or symbols. What do I mean by a sign or a symbol? It means that the the device you're using to communicate as at least one time removed from the original thing. And this is what I was saying before about communication and language aren't exactly the same. If there is a cat in the room and I point at the cat, I'm communicating. But that's not language. Language would be me communicating the concept of a cat without the cat being in the room. So think on that for a second. We're getting very theoretical this week. So like I was saying, when you create a shape that symbolizes a cat, or you come up with a series of sounds, at, cat, that represents that thing that meows and drives us crazy. You have encoded a concrete thing, an idea, into an abstract representation. One property of language is that it is what we refer to as generative or productive. We can take a system of signs and recombine them into different combinations and create new concepts. If this was a linguistics course, we'd have a whole module about how we can take the building blocks of language and reorder them to make new ideas. We'll be dealing with this soon when we get into the building blocks of literacy and talk about phonemes and graphemes and how we create words and ideas. So a fun topic of conversation in any linguistics course is whether or not language is unique to humans. A lot of people believe that language is one of the only things that truly sets us apart from animals. I've posted some interesting links and videos in our week 2 Blackboard area that you should definitely check out. One of them discusses whether or not animals have language. A lot of people say that their system it stops at communication. But people who research bee dances, for example, would argue that their system is generative and productive. So it's still being debated, like everything on the internet. What about computers? Um, we have people whose job it is to create programming languages that get our computers to run in certain ways. Does that count as language? Can a computer create its own language? There's some movies dedicated to that, right? And then a recent article that tickled me was about tree communication using the mycelial network of mushrooms. Some crazy stuff out there. So check it out. Have fun with it, and just keep thinking about it and asking interesting questions. Okay, language is a two-way street. Um, and this is definitely quiz worthy, by the way, for Sunday's quiz. Um, we have productive, also referred to as expressive. These are our outgoing messages. And then we have receptive, which are the incoming messages. And those can be further divided into spoken or written. But anytime I mention oral language, even if I don't explicitly state it, I am also referring to gesture, for example, American Sign Language. All right. So be able to, in your own words, explain productive versus receptive language and spoken slash gesture versus reading and writing. All right. Be able to do that by Sunday, 11:59 p.m. And please note, not all languages have all four domains. Just because a language does not have a writing system does not mean that it is not a language, and vice versa. Okay. Ooh, big topics here, and I have to give you the short version. In terms of human evolution, language is one of our newest talents. In a seated class, I have a whole activity where people run around the room and try to match these years to the activity. But I just want to point these out to you. We think, of course, we have no way of exactly knowing, but our most respected anthropologists and archaeologists believe that humans began speaking over 1 million years ago. The first counting marks were discovered and dated to be from 45,000 years ago. We're not getting our cave drawings that once removed representational communication until 30,000 years ago. First handwriting 5,000 years ago. First notated song 3,500 years ago. Evidence of the first books 2,000 years ago. And of course, those would have to be hand scribed because it wasn't until just a short 600 years ago that the printing press was invented. And then I saved this last one because it really should make you pause. It was only about 100 years ago that the literacy rate in the United States exceeded 50%. So I know each of us were born into a literate world, but this is pretty new when you really zoom out and think about it. All right, so when I say that language is a new talent, I also mean in terms of brain anatomy. It is in the most recently evolved parts of our brain that the language centers can be found. So that's kind of interesting. Again, entire classes are devoted to this. I don't expect you to become masters of neuroanatomy just yet, but what I would like you to know is that if you look at this, where does language live? Most of our language centers are found in the left hemisphere. Of course, a small percentage of people are born with their hemispheres flipped. So for some people, It is the right, but generally we're looking at the left hemisphere. Um, some words that might pop up in your studies as early childhood educators. You've got Broca's area and Wernicke's area. Broca's area is mostly associated with speech production, and Wernicke's area is for language comprehension. And if something goes wrong in either or both of those spots of the brain, then that directly impacts language, right? All right. These images are taken from a website that is fantastic. It's just one big long infographic. So if you go to the week 2 folder, you'll see that link. Check it out. Okay. Whew, this part is just muddy, and I'm already 12 minutes into this. So I'm really going to do a superficial overview. But if you go to your English or Experiences in Language Arts textbook and go to page 12, you can read along. Gonna really go fast here. Okay, the behaviorist theory emerged in the earlier 20th century, maybe at its peak post World War II in the 50s. The main idea here is that language is developed as a result of external reinforcement, be it positive or negative, in response to the language a child produces. If you think about the way children were taught at this time, with lots of correction and severe correction and repetition, you can see a match between that language theory and that teaching style. This has been pretty fully debunked at this point. However, the concept of marking errors and providing feedback, obviously that has not left our educational paradigm. You'll see a pattern here with each of these theories. It's like we've taken the parts that are workable and wrapped them into something that makes more sense. Okay, maturational came to height in probably around the 1960s, and it was a focus on genetics over if you've ever heard about nature versus nurture, this is focusing on nature. And so they identified for a typically developing child which stage they should be in at which age. And they identified signs of readiness at the point the child was ready to enter the next phase. So it's very didactic and categorical and firm and doesn't really allow for atypical development. And again, if you think back to the way education worked at that time, it kind of lines up. Okay. Predetermined. This again is sort of a nature over nurture, but it at least acknowledges environment. Noam Chomsky, famous linguist, definitely most uptrending, if you want to use that word, the 60s through the 90s, and people are still talking about Noam Chomsky, especially anybody who's into linguistics. He believes in a universal grammar, sort of an internal language acquisition device, which is really just all those areas of the brain and from that other slide. And he believes that children are born with this kind of preset computer that for language processing that is common across all languages, and the way a child will develop just depends on what culture and language they're born into and is present around them. And then that's the subset of language skills that they will develop. Okay, I mean that's pretty cool, but I there are some definite flaws in this. And again, if this was its own course, I'd get into that. You can absolutely look this up on your own. But my main critique of Chomsky is that if this is the case, what is the role for teachers? How does this theory of language acquisition inform pedagogy? And I've never felt much of an answer to that question, which is why if you look in educational textbooks and educational research and educational psychology, they don't talk a lot about Chomsky. Okay, you know who they do talk a lot about? Vygotsky. transactional slash interaction theory of language acquisition. This one, as you read it, you should kind of feel the shift. That's like, oh, okay, this is starting to look like how we really teach children today. Language is the result of social, emotional drives, getting your needs met as a developing child, using language as a means to connect. And so this is a great theory because it does inform educators. So, okay, what's our job? If this is how people develop language, what should the teachers do? Well, they should facilitate environments and events that spark language production, and then hang around and guide and model language for these students. You'll hear about the zone of proximity, and that's the zone between a child's independent level of ability and their ability when being guided by a teacher. And so we can decide what materials and lessons to present based on this zone of proximity. So it's like meeting them where they're at, but with giving them enough challenge so that they grow. And the constructivist theory, this one is interesting because they don't just name one person in the book. And if you look it up elsewhere online, there are a lot of players in this theory, a lot of names. I just put the three that I think are the most easily recognizable. John Dewey, if you've ever heard of the Dewey Decimal System, that's the guy. Jean Piaget, very popular among educational psychologists, and Maria Montessori, near and dear to my heart. This theory is interesting because it's been around longer than some of the other ones I mentioned, but it has persisted. And so that combined with the fact that there isn't like a father or mother of constructivism, that it's more of a larger group of people and it's endured over time, that to me, that makes for a favorable theory. And the other thing that I like about it is it doesn't dismantle the theory that came before it. It's very similar to the transactional and interaction theory. It's not at odds with it. It just kind of builds off of it. And the other thing I like about it, yes, I'm being biased here, it's not just a language theory, it's a teaching and learning theory. So it's incredibly useful to us as educators. The main claim or assumption of this theory is that children mentally construct their own theories based on their environment and experiences. Also, the longer that children are exposed to adult speech, the closer their speech resembles it. And so that's why we model language, but we don't correct theirs. These theorists identify the sorts of quote unquote errors that children have when they are developing language wise, and note that adults don't model those errors. So where are they coming from? It's clearly part of a process. An example is adding a past tense to an irregular past tense verb. Instead of I sat on the floor, I sitted on the floor. If you've worked with children, you know that they do this. They add the ed, and sometimes adults around them will correct it, or the adults will just model the proper, quote unquote, proper usage. What's important here is that educators facilitate inquiry, the process of seeking answers to questions, the process of generating questions to begin with, and facilitating the ability for children themselves to identify patterns and connections. Oh gosh, I could go on forever about this. The bottom line of all this, like I said before, you don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. There are gems found in each one of these theories. There are things that we hold on to and continue to use, but then we are informed by the more emergent theories. So yeah, and also it's just good as an educator to sort of know your history, because people will drop these words or these names around you, and I think it's important that you're in the loop basically, and you know what's being discussed. Woo! All right, moving along. Language disorders. I'm just going to provide a very brief overview of the types of disorders and the causes. This is just really the tip of the iceberg here, but so types, it kind of matches how language works. You can have receptive disorders. You can have expressive or productive disorders, but most of the time, if someone presents with one, they also present with the other. So this is why specialists are so important, why speech language pathologists are so important. It's rarely a simple situation. So, what causes language disorders? Well, you can be born with a neurological difference. Examples would be autism or dyslexia. You can be born with a chromosomal difference, which affects not usually just language, but many other aspects of development. You can sustain a brain injury or develop a brain lesion or tumor from a disease. And if those injuries or lesions are at the site of those language centers, language will be impacted. Also, stroke, right? Everyone probably knows of someone who's had a stroke and then had to have language therapy or speech therapy to regain what was lost. The other thing is problems during pregnancy or birth. That can range from poor nutrition, fetal alcohol syndrome, premature birth. The list goes on and on. But I do want to take a moment to bust a myth that learning more than one language or having more than one language present in the home does not cause language disorders. All right. That's an important one. If you hear anyone around you say that, bust them. Okay. Standard English, what is it? How does it play into what we're doing as early childhood educators? I would be lying to you if I said there wasn't such a thing as standard English. Of course there is. Look at your APA guidelines, right? We do have conventional grammar, punctuation rules, capitalization rules. We have preferred words to use in academic and professional settings, but this is all a social construct decided by a fairly privileged group of people, and it's only important in very specific environments. So, I think this is very important. Children must be permitted to use their home language, and when I say home language, I mean dialect, accent, word choice, in the classroom as a foundation upon which to build their literacy. Learning the rules of academic or professional English can come later. All right? Children cannot learn without access to their prior experiences and knowledge, and that information is encoded by their home language. So if you deny them of that, they cannot learn, and that is unfair to them. So this is always a good time to go back and review the EDU 280 Big Ten ideas. 4 of the 10 are related to this. Don't correct errors, don't silence students, invite non-standard language and dialects into your classroom. And then when you are talking with children, you can model the grammatical and standard language. And depending on the age and the situation, you can even get into what code switching is and how when I'm at home or I'm with my friends, I talk like this. But when I have to write a paragraph for class, I make some adjustments, and here's why. When I teach my college level composition courses, I talk about this a lot. But you can see why at the preschool level, this is our main goal here is to just get them talking, get them reading, get them writing. And if you overcorrect them, they will learn to stop production. And that's the last thing we want.